Hey everyone, welcome back. We've been taking a look at the collection of short stories called In Our Time that Hemingway writes, and mainly centering on the idea, the theme of love. And I wanted to trace that theme. How do we see it in various stories in our time? And you can then apply this to other stories that we see that are in the collection that I'm not necessarily going to specifically address, but some things that I want you to be able to think about within the larger picture. How is Hemingway defining love? And then we'll take a look at how he's defining war. We took a look at last time The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, and we see some of that complexities of love and relationships. I'm going to continue that with The End of Something. What we see within The End of Something is Nick Adams now having a relationship, and so now he's a little bit older, probably in his teens, maybe 16, 17, somewhere in there, having a relationship. And I want you to think about, what does he learn from his father and mother, and how do we see that affecting the way he sees relationships? And so we kind of see that continuing theme as this development of the character of Nick Adams, and what does he learn? I want you to think about, as we go through The End of Something, a couple of things. In what ways is this setting, right? They're in northern Michigan, kind of on this lake. They're going to a beach to have this nice picnic, right? So it's kind of this idyllic setting to have this romantic kind of date night. In what ways is it an ideal setting? And so then but there's something also wrong that's happening here. What do we see that's wrong? And in what ways is Marge a perfect match for Nick Adams, right? And so we see this idyllic setting, this idyllic date, and then we see Marge, who seems to be a perfect companion for Nick. But then there's something wrong, right? The end of something is this end of a relationship. And so what's really happening here? I wanted to, the first paragraph takes a look at Hortons Bay, which is in northern Michigan, up in the Petoskey area, towards the tip of the kind of Michigan shaped as a hand, towards the tip of the ring finger. If you were to hold the palm of your right hand towards you, it's up at the tip of the ring finger. And it's, again, it was a lumbering town, but now it's changed, right? So Nick, when he was young, it was a lumbering town, and now something has changed as the town is starting to modernize. And so, again, the setting's a big part of Hemingway's stories that sets the stage. In the old days, Hortons Bay was a lumbering town. No one who lived in it was out of the sound of the big saws in the mill by the lake. Then one year, there were no more logs to make lumber. The lumber schooners came in to the bay and were loaded with the cut of the mill that stood stacked in the yard. All the piles of lumber were carried away. The big mill building and all its machinery that was removed, taken out and hoisted on board of one of the schooners by the men who had worked in the mill. The schooners moved out of the bay toward the open lake, carrying the two great saws. The traveling carriage that hurled the logs against the revolving circular saws, and all the rollers, wheels, belts, and iron piled on the whole deep load of lumber. Its open hold covered with canvas and lashed tight. The sails of the schooner filled, and it moved out of the open lake, carrying with it everything that had made the mill a mill, and Hortons Bay a town. And so this is a town that used to get its livelihood on lumber, and now the entire industry of the town has been taken away, right? So we have to think about, what is that going to do, right, as it sets the stage. Some of you might be in towns that used to have some type of industry that soon closed down. I grew up in Michigan in Battle Creek, which had Post and Kellogg's. And then all of a sudden in the 1990s, Kellogg's moved all their operations down to Mexico. And so what you have is this loss of industry, right? And this loss of life. And that's kind of what's keeping this town together. And so now you have just the remnants. And this is setting the stage for this kind of loss of love that we see. It's something that's going to be hollow within this relationship. The one-story bunkhouses, the eating houses, the company store, the mill offices, and the big mill itself stood deserted in the acres of sawdust that covered the swampy meadow by the shore of the bay. 10 years later, right, so now this is 10 years after kind of Nick is a little bit older, there was nothing of the mill left except the broken white limestone of its foundation showing through the swampy second growth as Nick and Marjorie rowed along the shore. They were trolling along the edge of the channel bank where the bottom dropped off suddenly from the sandy shallows to 12 feet of dark water. They were trolling on their way to the point to set night lines for rainbow trout. And so they're out fishing. They're kind of rowing around, trolling for fish. There's our old ruin, Nick, Marjorie said. And so she takes a look at this old kind of lumbering town or the old factory. She says it's kind of her ruin. So she has this romantic kind of chivalrous, medieval kind of, hey, look at this. This is kind of something that connects us. But again, Nick doesn't necessarily see that. He's seeing something different. So I want you to think about what's going on with Nick. Nick, rowing, looked at the white stone in the green trees. There it is, he said. Can you remember when it was a mill? Marjorie asked. I can just remember, Nick said. It seems more like a castle, right? So it kind of has this romantic imagination. Nick said nothing. Again, that's important to note. They rowed out in the sight. They rowed on out of sight of the mill, following the shoreline. Then Nick cut across the bay. They aren't striking, he said. Right? So again, that idea of striking. What's that striking mean? Probably the fish, right? The fish aren't striking. No, Marjorie said. She was intent on the rod all the time they trolled, even when she talked. She loved to fish. She loved to fish with Nick. One thing that we learn about Nick in Indian camp as a young boy is he learns how to fish with his father. Then in The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, he goes out hunting. And so Nick is an outdoorsman. He loves this kind of stuff. And now his girlfriend is loving this as well, right? And I'm not sure why in the over here it says Marone. I don't know who Marone is. It's the typo. I copied and pasted this from the internet, so obviously the internet did not have that particular part right, but it is Marjorie. That's who it's referring to. Close beside the boat, a big trout broke to the surface of the water. Nick pulled hard on one oar so the boat would turn and the bait spinning far behind would pass where the trout was feeding. As the trout's back came up out of the water, the minnows jumped wildly. They sprinkled the surface like a handful of shot thrown into the water. Another trout broke the water, feeding on the other side of the boat. They pulled the boat up on the beach, and Nick lifted out the pail of the perch. The perch swam in the water in the pail. Nick caught 3 of them with his hand and cut their heads off and skinned them while Marjorie chased with her hands in the bucket, finally caught a perch, cut its head off, and skinned it. Nick looked at her fish, right? So he's taking a look at, she's able to do exactly what he's able to. She's able to, she's cutting off the head, she's skinning it, she's doing exactly what she's doing. Nick looked at her fish. I'm not sure what he sees. I'm not sure if it's a bigger fish. I don't know. It seems like she's pretty good at what she does. Who knows, right? He hooked each of the skinned perch through the tail. There were 2 hooks attached to a leader on each rod. Then Marjorie rowed the boat out over the channel bank, holding the line in her teeth, and looking toward Nick, who stood on the shore, holding the rod and letting the line run out from the reel. Marjorie, who's now rowing, rowed up the point a little way so she would not disturb the line. So she's skilled at this. She knows that you don't want to scare the fish. She pulled hard on the oars, and the boat went way up on the beach. And I want you to think about this. Those who've been out rowing, how hard do you have to pull in order to get the boat off out of the water and way up onto the beach, right? So she can hold her own. Little waves came in with it. Marjorie stepped out of the boat, and Nick pulled the boat high up on the beach. What's the matter, Nick? Marjorie asked. I don't know, Nick said, getting wood for a fire. Marjorie unpacked the basket of supper. I don't feel like eating, said Nick. Come on and eat, Nick. All right. They ate without talking and watched the 2 rods in the firelight in the water. There's going to be a big moon tonight, Nick said. He looked across the bay to the hills that were beginning to sharpen against the sky. Beyond the hills, he knew the moon was coming up, right? So again, they're out, they're fishing, and they're having this wonderful picnic, this kind of romantic setting. The moon is up, everything is right, and then everything goes wrong. I know it, Marjorie said happily. You know everything, Nick said. Oh, Nick, please cut it out. Please don't be that way. I can't help it, Nick said. You do. You know everything. That's the trouble. You know you do. Marjorie did not say anything. Again, now we have that kind of role reversal. I've taught you everything. You know you do. What don't you know anyway? Oh, shut up, Marjorie said. there comes the moon, right? So again, when you think about this relationship, what's going on underneath the surface? They sat on the blanket without touching each other and watched the moon rise. You don't have to talk silly, Marjorie said. What's really the matter? I don't know. Of course you know. No, I don't. Go on and say it. Nick looked on at the moon coming up over the hills. It isn't fun anymore. He was afraid to look at Marjorie. Then he looked at her. She sat there with her back toward him. He looked at her back. It isn't fun anymore. Not any of it. She didn't say anything. He went on. I feel as though everything has gone to hell inside of me. I don't know, Marge. I don't know what to say. He looked on at her back. Isn't love any fun? Marjorie said. No, Nick said. Marjorie stood up. Nick sat there, his head in his hands. I'm going to take the boat, Marjorie called to him. You can walk back around the point. All right, Nick said. I'll push the boat off for you. You don't need to, she said. She was afloat in the boat on the water with the moonlight on it. Nick went back and lay down with his face in the blanket by the fire. He could hear Marjorie rowing on the water. And I want you to think about who's more devastated by the loss of a relationship. Is Marjorie or does Nick seem to be more devastated? And if it's Nick, why did Nick end it? Why did Nick break up? What's going on? He lay there for a long time. He lay there while he heard Bill come into the clearing, walking around to the woods. He felt Bill coming up to the fire. Bill didn't touch him either. Did she go all right? Bill said. Yes, Nick said, lying his face on the blanket. Again, there's some interesting kind of complexity here. First of all, it seems as though Bill already knew about what was going to happen, so it seems like Bill and Nick were already talking about this, and that kind of gets us to understand a little bit what's kind of happening behind the surface, who's kind of pushing or pulling the strings, or what's going on inside Nick's head, and this idea that Nick said yes, and then he says lying, right? So that could mean two things, or it could be his face is literally lying on the blanket, but it also could be that he was lying about, what's going on and how it transpired. Bill asks, have any scene? No, there wasn't any scene. I think that's true, right? How do you feel? Oh, go away, Bill. Go away for a while. Bill selected a sandwich from the lunch basket and walked over to have a look at the rods. And so here we see kind of this young love, this young relationship. And it seems as though everything's going right, and then everything goes wrong, right? When you think about what is the argument here, what's the main theme that we're to learn from this? What does Nick learn? What does he learn from his father about what happens when things get difficult? How does he handle it? What's happening within this relationship? What might be some fears that Nick has that he's kind of carried over from his own family dynamics that he's now bringing to his relationships? What's happening within Marge, right? How does Marge handle this? Is she broken up by it? Why is Nick so devastated by this if he wanted to happen? So these are some deeper themes that I want you to think about as you go through this story with a closer reading.